What I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on what I said in my last video. In my last video, I touched a little bit on democracy and what democracy is. I talked about the lifespan of the state, but I really just gave a very, very basic overview. I talked a little bit about Weimar Germany as an example, just one example. Probably not the best because it was such a short lifespan. First, if you are appreciating this material, please like my videos and subscribe to my channel if you want to automatically get my videos. I'd greatly appreciate it. What I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to talk about specifically the United States of America. I'm going to talk about the difference between republicanism and democracy. I'm going to talk about the beginning stages of this republic, what it was like when it was born, the transitions that it has gone through as it has become, as it has resembled more and more a democracy. And I'm going to explain what we are likely to expect in the future as we become more and more democratic. And a lot of this wisdom, a lot of it's common sense if you spend a lot of time thinking about it, but a lot of it is ancient wisdom that we have written down from philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle actually gave a lot of good evidence. He collected a lot of information from many different city-states in his area during his time period. Aristotle was the student of Plato. But I'm going to start at the beginning, and I'm going to talk about how we went from a country that had slavery and was mostly controlled by property owners, and how we are now in a phase where we have a universal vote and we are discussing things like getting rid of the Electoral College. Now, the first thing that I want to note is the difference between these concepts of conservative and liberal. So, generally speaking, if someone who is conservative, or an idea that is conservative, typically somebody who is conservative typically doesn't want things to change, okay? Somebody who is liberal embraces change. So right, wrong, or indifferent, those are how the two, generally speaking, how those two ideas separate themselves. And how it reflects itself in American politics is we have developed two dominant parties, one of which is called the Republican Party, the other is called the Democrat Party. And these two parties, typically, they tend to reflect a form of conservatism and a form of, I'll use the word liberalism, although there's other definitions of the word liberal that have to do with free trade, and I'm not going to discuss. So first I want to talk about slavery. So the United States was officially founded as a single federal government in the year 1787, or you could argue 1788, when the ninth state officially ratified the Constitution, making it a legal document. And there had been a previous arrangement under the Articles of Confederation. This did not unify the federal government as one country. Our founding date is 1776. That is when the colonies joined together, the 13 united colonies joined together in defiance of British rule, and they went to war and won their own sovereignty. But it wasn't until about 1787, 1788, where we had a solid, centrally binding constitution that still functions to this day. So there was a practice known as slavery in the United States, started by, in our particular area, started by the British. The slave trade was not started by the British, but it was the British brought slavery to the United States. A very, very, very small minority of people owned slaves in the United States. And there is, in the Constitution, there was put in a clause, it's called the 3/5 Compromise. So what the 3/5 Compromise was there was a debate between how different states were going to be represented in Congress. Now, the 3/5 compromise does not say that slaves were 3/5 of a person. That's not what it says. That's a common misconception. What the 3/5 compromise says is 3/5 all other persons. This is referring to a vote count. So this is how representatives were going to be counted in Congress, because the slave states, obviously, they wanted their slaves counted to give them greater representation in Congress. The non-slaveholding states, they wanted a greater weight of their representatives in Congress. So the compromise became 3/5 of the slave population could be counted in determining the census. Now, there was something else that was introduced into the Constitution, and this was the clause that said no law, Congress can make no law, essentially, that affects the importation of slavery before the year 1808. Okay? So this gave about a 20-year period where the issue of slavery basically could not be touched. And I don't know all the legal discussions that were occurring at the time, but it basically put a 20-year hold on slavery. The reason for this was because we were a new nation, the United States was a new country, and in order for there to be some form of cohesion and agreement as this new government was set up, this very, very controversial subject and very difficult to solve problem, which was slavery, could not be the first issue dealt with. That was just the reality of the nature of what was going on. And I want to say, from the very first Congress, there were members who wanted to get rid of slavery, but it was not possible, and eventually the cancer, if you will, grew and got to the point where we ended up having a civil war over it. And luckily, the patient known as the United States survived this cancer, and we are here to this day. The Republic survived, and so I will continue. So, another thing, the word democracy, okay? We love to throw the word democracy around a lot now in the Western world. Not just in the United States, but also in the democratic powers in Europe and elsewhere that were not democratic when the United States was born. So, the word democracy, it does not show up anywhere in the Constitution. It does not show up in the Declaration of Independence. And there is a lot of writing, the most classic case being John Adams, where democracy was very much frowned upon by the founders. This was not because they were racist, although many of them I'm sure were. This was not because they were racist or anything else. It was because they had a very good political understanding and historical perspective of some of the things which I'm going to touch on a little bit later on in this video. But they wanted to put the brakes on what this thing called democracy was. So instead, what they wanted to do is they wanted to create a constitutional republic. They wanted to create a rule of law, okay? Not ruled by a monarch, not ruled by the people, rule of law, okay? And one of the ways that we had this cohesive rule of law is something we refer to as equal protection and due process. So this gives equal protection and it gives rights to the individual, but it did not create a democracy from the very beginning, okay? So democracy was not the intention of the founders, although many of them, the brilliant ones, the political philosophers that we hear of, like Thomas Jefferson and all them, though I don't believe Jefferson signed the Constitution, those founders, they very much understood the dangers of democracy, and they were aware that that very likely would be our destiny down the road. And I'm going to show you how that people who had those opinions, they would be right. And I can predict in the future things that are going to occur, not because I'm a prophet, but because I have a rational brain, I can use common sense, and I've studied the ancients, and I have an understanding of how, sociologically, how large groups tend to organize themselves and evolve. So, first president that I want to talk to about is Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was the 7th president of the United States. The reason I want to talk about Andrew Jackson first, Andrew Jackson was is referred to by many as the first Democrat, okay? There were originally anti-federalists and federalists as the country was being formed. There were other smaller parties, but essentially what ended up happening as a natural unfolding of how our system works, we got two parties. The Democrat Party formed before the Republican Party, but the Democrat Party formed first. And we can say that Andrew Jackson was the first Democrat. So, not only was he the first Democrat, Andrew Jackson was what we would refer to as the first non-aristocrat, you could argue. So, what I mean by that is the first 6 presidents were all very, very wealthy, and they were insiders as far as the founding generation, and then those who were well connected to the crown initially, but then those who were also, after the United States was formed, they were like the aristocracy. And of course my alarm's going off. They were like the aristocracy. They were very wealthy, and they had much of control over these in-groups at the top of the pyramid, so to speak. Andrew Jackson was a friend of the people, so to speak. He was born in poverty. He was not of an aristocratic background, and he was hated. He was hated by the swamp, so to speak. This is why Donald Trump, love him or hate him, Donald Trump has a portrait of Andrew Jackson in the Oval Office. Andrew Jackson was a lot like President Trump, or President Trump was a lot like Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was hated by the aristocracy because Andrew Jackson was a friend of the people, okay? What Andrew Jackson wanted to do, and what he is responsible for, is he was responsible for spreading suffrage to all white voters, okay? That was what he wanted to do. So he appealed to this very large number of people. So this is really the first big move to include a lot more people and to make the United States a lot more of a democratic system. So those who were conservative in their time, they did not want universal white suffrage. Property owners had the right to vote. Those who were voting were very wealthy people in the early days, and most white people could not vote. Just for the record, just a side note, the most liberal state at the time was actually Rhode Island. Rhode Island was a special case where Rhode Island allowed for people with very little amounts of property to vote before any other state. I'll just throw that in there because I'm actually from Rhode Island, and I know that fact. So this now opened the door, and there are historians who also argue that race relations actually got worse. Supremacy actually got worse after universal white suffrage. I don't know if that's true or not, but the argument is that there was now almost like a two-tier class in areas where there were large white and large black populations. Now the whites now had political stake, where they didn't before. It was just a handful of aristocrats, very wealthy aristocrats. Now, after this Jacksonian era, we're going to see a lot more voters. Okay? Now, fast forward a little bit. I mentioned slavery. I mentioned the Civil War that almost ended the lifespan of this republic, but we survived, and we through legal means, we amended the Constitution and we allowed for black suffrage. So now black men could vote. Okay, so all black men could vote. And there were many things that occurred for years after by states with predominantly black populations that they tried to prevent blacks from voting. Not only that, they also tried to prevent poor whites from voting. They had poll taxes and things like that. This was to keep as many people from voting as possible. Okay, the aristocrats wanted to hold on to their power. Now, John C. Calhoun, who has a very bad name for many people, but just simply the fact of the matter is, John C. Calhoun made this prediction, and he's right in a lot of ways. Essentially, this country has to split into two parties, and you're basically going to get the party of the taxpayer, and then you're going to get the party of people who are receiving benefits from the taxpayer. And to a large extent, that is what we have. That was a prediction that he made. This is why the founders only wanted property owners to vote, and people who had financial stake in the game, this is why. Because they weren't going to vote away the property of their peers. Once you spread the vote around, now poorer people who are not super wealthy, now they have the ability to vote money out of the treasury. All right? They have now political influence. So what this did was, now in the 1860s now, in the United States, now we have the black vote. So we have universal voting for all men in the country. So, as you can see already, what is happening is we are transitioning into democracy. Slowly. We've already started to transition into democracy. Now, many of the founders could have been able to predict this, okay? And many of the ancient philosophers that we have heard of, many of them, if they could appear in our time or in their time, they wouldn't have been surprised. They could see that this is how it was going to unfold. Before I forget, because I didn't write it down on my little guideline here, the United States Senate, okay? In the early 20th century, the United States Senate went through a change. Now, initially, the writers of the Constitution, they wrote that the House of Representatives would be elected by the people through apportionment. The Senate would be chosen by the legislatures of the individual states. So the senators were not chosen by the people. The senators were chosen by the legislatures. So indirectly by the people, you might argue. Okay? In the early 20th century, the Constitution was amended. And what this did was, now senators would be elected by popular vote. So we as just everyday people, now we are electing the senators now. Okay, the legislature does not choose the senators anymore that go to Congress. Okay, so also what happened in the early 20th century, women's suffrage. Okay, this was something else, and it bothers me that I can't remember which amendment it was. It might have been the 20th. It might have been the 20th Amendment. But either way, beginning of the 20th century, we had women's suffrage. This gave the right to vote to all women. So now we have a much larger class of voters. So whites of all incomes can now vote. Blacks can now vote. Women can now vote. We have a much larger voting pool. Also at the beginning of the 20th century, funny enough, we see the birth of the modern welfare state. We end up seeing people like FDR begin to get elected. And something else that happened at the beginning of the 20th century, you saw the beginning of Democrat dominance in Congress. The Democrat dominance. So in our period of time, in the previous couple of decades, in American politics, what it seems like is there's like this 50-50. It goes back and forth between Republican and Democrat. Okay? It's not always like that in American history. There are periods where one party has dominance over another party. The middle of the 20th century was overwhelmingly dominated by Democrats. It actually wasn't until, I believe, the 90s, the Republicans did not control the Congress again, or control the House of Representatives again. During the late 1800s, however, we had overwhelming Republican dominance. Then we started to have the expansion of voting rights. We saw the creation of the modern welfare state, and we saw this period of Democrat dominance. Okay, and during this period of American history, the Democrats were very much appealing to poor workers. So that's when we got a lot of union movements, and we got a lot of legislation that was passed to protect the rights of workers, because they had an incredible amount of political power relative to what they used to have. So this was reflected in American politics. Now, fast forward a little bit farther, you have the 18-year-old vote. In the 1960s and 70s, the United States got involved in a very unpopular war in Vietnam. And prior to the war in Vietnam, the voting age was 21. You had to be 21 years old to vote. We amended the Constitution yet again, because the thought process was, how can you send young men who are 18 years old to go fight in war, and they don't even have a right to vote. So we amended the Constitution and we gave suffrage to 18-year-olds. Okay? So again, the voting pool is continuing to expand. We are becoming more and more akin to democracy. More and more voices are being entered into the system. And again, what I want to make clear here, this is right, wrong, or indifferent. Okay? This is simply the way things are unfolded. You could say that the intentions of the founders were wrong. They should have been more inclusive. You could say that modern political scientists are being irresponsible and reckless. You can have either or, but this is simply the way it has unfolded. Now, I want to talk specifically about Congress, okay? Because Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution talks about what powers the Congress of the United States has, okay? One of the powers that is in there is the power to deal with monetary policy. Those words aren't in there. But to regulate commerce. States do have a right to make gold and silver coin legal tender. They do have a right to do that, but that's not very hasn't been very relevant. It gives Congress monetary authority, financial oversight. The House of Representatives has the right to initiate bills for raising revenue, for raising taxes. The Senate, of course, has to ratify this, but they have monetary authority. They have the power of the purse. It also gives the Congress the power to declare war, Article 1, Section 8. What we have seen, in particular in the 20th century, we saw the creation of the Federal Reserve System in the United States. The Federal Reserve controls the currency and controls the money supply. So, Congress has oversight over the Federal Reserve, but Congress has very much delegated its authority to the Federal Reserve. It has delegated its monetary authority to unelected bureaucrats. The war powers. Congress has very much, well, they have the power to declare war, and there will always be an ongoing debate as to how much war powers the president has, how much war powers Congress has. That's an ongoing debate. However, the shift has occurred to where the president now has more power when it comes to war than at any other time. So, as a matter of fact, I would have to see if President Trump renewed it. I would imagine he would. But ever since 2001, we have been in a state of emergency. So we have been in a state of the federal government. The executive branch has had a lot of power, a lot of executive power when it comes to war powers, and we are most likely still in that state of emergency to this day. Okay. The reason I want to say this. So while at the same time we have the expansion of voting rights and the increase in the voices of the everyday people, it's interesting that Congress, the voice of the people, the mouthpiece of the people, Congress has delegated away much of its responsibility with two of arguably the most important things that Congress can oversee: monetary policy and war powers. And monetary policy, by the way, the founders of the Constitution very specifically wanted the representatives of the people to have the first say when it comes to raising taxes. Okay? What the Federal Reserve has the power to do, it has the ability, it affects the money supply. When the Federal Reserve, when it inflates the money supply, it is like taxation without representation. It is taking purchasing power away from the money that you have without consulting Congress. Here's an example. There is a gentleman that I know, and he told me he has, he's a well-off individual financially, but he told me that he has had over $100,000 in a bank account. I used to receive a lot of interest in banks. You don't today, and I'm not going to get into the 2008 financial crisis and the mess we're in right now, but he has $100,000 in a bank account. So, he had $100,000 in the bank in 2018. and he has $100,000 in the bank right now. So let's say that inflation is 2%. That's the Fed's inflation target. I think inflation is much higher than that, as do many other people who know what's going on. However, we'll say that it's 2%. That $100,000 in 2018, that 2% inflation, what it did, it took 2% of the purchasing power. It basically took $2,000 worth of 2018 dollars away from this individual, and now he only has $98,000 worth of 2018 dollars. Now, there's the illusion that he hasn't lost any money, right? Because the number is still the same. He still has $100,000, but his purchasing power has decreased. These are bureaucrats who have taken away his purchasing power. It is taxation without representation, and it gives the government a lot of power and room when it comes to things like war and spending. Okay? It gives them a lot of power that the founders never would have wanted them to have. So, now we're at a point where we are much more democratic now than we were in the 1780s. And I want to talk a little bit about something called the Academy Awards. I talked a little bit about artists in my last video. Please go ahead and check it out. I talked about artists. Now, I also, in this video, I've been talking about certain philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. Something that's very important to understand in our culture is that Plato probably had the biggest influence on our culture, okay? Even more than Jesus, I would argue. And that's a very fair argument to make. Regardless of what your opinions are of religion or Christianity, that's not what I'm saying. I'm simply saying that because of Greek influence, because of the information that was exchanged, even Jesus himself, if he existed, perhaps he said exactly what people think he said. He used Greek terms. He used Greek terminology when he said, "I am the Logos," and when he talked about, "I am the All God." These are Greek concepts. So everything, our art and everything else, very much has Greek roots. Some people are not aware of this. So, what the Academy Awards are, the Academy Awards are a display of this wisdom that these ancient philosophers had, and it's portrayed on the screen. And you will see a lot of these concepts, you will see them on the screen if you have eyes to see, and the reason they're called the Academy Awards, and why, by the way, Hollywood producers, they typically all have philosophy degrees. A lot of the artwork that comes out of Hollywood, it's a reflection of these philosophical concepts. Plato established the academy at Lyceum, the first Western academy, so to speak. And that is why they are called the Academy Awards. So, you can see this portrayed in many different ways. It's very cool to see. A very good example is in the modern Batman movies actually have a lot of these philosophical concepts right out in the open. But in particular, the Batman movie with Bane, The Dark Knight Rises, I think it is the one. Bane, when he takes control of the city, when he gives power to the people, when he lets them become the judge and jury and the executioners of the establishment, they are portraying what they know is to come. They are portraying the ancient wisdom. They are portraying this understanding of human nature, the cycles of states, the cycles of human psychology and sociology. That's what they're putting on the screen. Which brings us to today and what we can predict into the future. So, the Electoral College. Now, we have seen in most of our lifetimes 2 presidents get elected who won the Electoral College, but they did not win the popular vote. Many people have a problem with that. Now, if people were competing for the popular vote, their campaign strategy would be different. So, are they winning by the right means? Arguably, yes. They're playing by the rules, so to speak. They're playing according to the rules of the game. But what we have seen, in particular since 2016, we have seen the undermining of faith in elections. Regardless of whether you believe that Donald Trump is legitimate president or whether you think he is an illegitimate president. We've seen the undermining in elections, okay? I don't want people to take for granted the gravity of this situation. I don't want people to take for granted what that means, okay? And I want you to take that fact and I want you to apply it to everything that I'm saying here, okay? Faith in the presidential election has been undermined in the United States of America for the first time. So now we have debates, big debates. People want to get rid of the Electoral College, right? We want to have abolish the Electoral College, and we want the popular vote to elect the president, right? There are many arguments for the Electoral College. There are arguments against it. Point is, we get rid of the Electoral College, we will become even more democratic than we are now. Popular referendum, okay? Right now, Congress passes the laws. Many bills start in the House, they go to the Senate for ratification. Sometimes it goes the other way around. But it is designed that people have an indirect voice through Congress. So a more elite, if you will, group of people, many of them lawyers, are making the laws, passing the laws, approving the laws. And I'm going to tell you now, and this surprised me because after I made this prediction, I can't remember who it was. Somebody actually mentioned it. Some candidate actually mentioned it. There will be a time. There will be in the unfolding of this democratic process. There will be a time when popular referendum is being discussed, where the people get to vote. Congress may write the laws, but popular referendum will ratify the laws. And I understand that many European countries do that. I understand that a lot of other democracies do that. And in this video, I don't have time to go into why our case would be different, okay? It's not the same thing. It would not have the same consequences, but I don't have time in this video to explain why the consequences would not be the same. It's not the same as having a parliament in another country. It would have much different ramifications if the United States passed its laws through popular referendum, okay? But this is very likely to happen. If you understand the ancient wisdom, if you understand how societies evolve, how democracies, how republics evolve, you'll understand this is very likely to happen. Immigration. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about Aristotle, because most of this is about Plato. Aristotle was the student of Plato. I cannot tell you, if you read Aristotle's Politics in particular, I cannot tell you how many times when he discusses immigration, this is a classic case. And Victor Davis Hanson, if you want to listen to a great historian, Victor Davis Hanson talks a lot about immigration. He's very knowledgeable on immigration. Overwhelming immigration policies, unrestrained immigration policies, opening up the gates, allowing people to flood in and infiltrate society, okay? This happened, this was very typical in many of the ancient city-states, and it was a sign of decline. Now, people want to point to the early 20th century and how many immigrants we let in and all that. Okay, first off, there was very much an understanding that these people needed to assimilate. So we can only allow so many people in, and they have to assimilate to our culture. They can't overwhelm our culture and create enclaves, separate groups, like a salad bowl. The idea is that we are a melting pot. First. Second, there were decades after this mass migration from Europe, there were decades where the United States virtually shut down immigration in this country. A lot of people don't know that. The media doesn't talk about it. Okay? But immigration, it's a big issue, and it is part of the reason why it's a main reason why Donald Trump got elected, because it's a big problem. It's a big issue. What I want to leave you with is this understanding of how a life cycle of a state works. I touched on it in my other video, my previous video. I recommend you check it out. I talk about the appetites phase. And what I'm going to tell you, the most likely thing that's going to occur in the future. While it would be very hard to do, it's very possible we might get rid of the Electoral College. I doubt it. That's much more harder to do than popular referendum, but it's possible. we will see popular referendum at some point. And the people will vote on war. The people will vote on monetary policy. They'll vote on how money is spent. They'll vote on immigration. They will vote on what is popular at that time. We are entering the appetites phase. And somebody is going to come along and they are going to take advantage of this. Someday somebody will come along and they will take advantage of this. And they will take advantage of what 51% of the people want. It's very easy to give 51% of the appetites what they want, right? When the stomach now has more power than the head, the stomach has more influence over the body than the head, it's very easy for somebody to come along, especially when things become more and more chaotic, as it's less about rule of law and more about rule by the people. Somebody will come along and take advantage of this. This is what the ancients have warned us about. This is what the ancients have told us. This is what the philosophers, those who are receiving Academy Awards, this is what they are portraying on the screen. Watch it in many videos. Or watch it in trailers. I've seen it portrayed in comedies even. Okay? We maintain this system one generation at a time. That's what we have. We have one generation at a time. This is something many people don't understand. It's something that many people need to understand. Please, if you enjoy this content, please like this video. Please subscribe to my channel. And I look forward to posting more content in the future.